The blaze danced across the open plains like a living thing, consuming everything in its path with a ferocious hunger that knew no mercy. Clara Mitchell had never seen anything like it in her 23 years of life. The dry summer of 1876 had turned the Wyoming territory into a tinderbox, and now, as fate would have it, she found herself directly in the path of nature's wrath. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs as she urged her tired mare forward, the smoke burning her eyes and lungs. She had left her family's homestead that morning to deliver medicine to a neighbor, never imagining that the small plume of smoke on the horizon would grow into this monstrous inferno that now chased her with unrelenting determination. "Come on, Penny," she pleaded with her horse, whose nostrils flared with panic. The wind shifted suddenly, sending a wall of heat directly toward them. Penny reared, throwing Clara from the saddle. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs as she watched her terrified horse bolt away. Struggling to her feet, Clara ran, her long skirts hampering her movements. The roar of the fire grew louder, drowning out even the sound of her own ragged breathing. Through stinging tears, she spotted a cluster of sagebrush ahead, the only cover in the vast expanse of prairie grass. With the last of her strength, she stumbled toward it, knowing it offered little protection against the approaching flames. The heat was unbearable now. Clara pressed herself against the fragrant sagebrush, feeling its brittle branches scratch her skin through her cotton dress. She closed her eyes, saying a silent prayer as the wildfire closed in. The sagebrush wouldn't save her, but there was nowhere else to run. Then, through the crackling roar of the fire, she heard the thundering of hoofbeats. Opening her eyes, she saw a rider emerging from the smoke like an apparition, pushing his horse to an impossible speed. The man was tall in the saddle, his bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth, his hat pulled low against the flying ash. He reached her just as the leading edge of the fire licked at the ground nearby. Without slowing his horse, he leaned down, strong arms scooping her up in one fluid motion. Clara found herself pressed against his chest, the solid rhythm of his heart steady beneath her ear despite their dire circumstances. "Hold tight," he shouted above the inferno's roar, spurring his horse forward. Clara wrapped her arms around his waist, clinging to this stranger as they raced against death itself. The man's Mustang knew fear but trusted its rider, charging ahead through the smoke. They reached a shallow creek, and the cowboy guided his mount into the water, fighting to keep control as the animal slid down the embankment. Standing in the creek, the cowboy quickly dismounted, pulling Clara down with him. Without hesitation, he shrugged out of his long duster coat and dunked it in the water. Clara watched in confusion as he thoroughly soaked the heavy canvas garment. "The fire's coming fast," he explained, his voice deep and urgent. "This won't stop it, but it might give us a chance." He wrapped the dripping coat around her shoulders, the sudden cold a shocking contrast to the blistering heat. Clara shivered as water trickled down her neck and back, but understood immediately. The wet coat would offer some protection against the burning embers that now filled the air like deadly fireflies. "Stay low," he instructed, pulling her down into the shallow water. "Cover your face with the coat when I tell you." They crouched in the creek as the wildfire reached its banks. The heat was intense, stealing the breath from their lungs. The man pushed Clara deeper into the water, shielding her body with his own as he too pulled a section of the wet coat over his head. "Now," he shouted, and Clara ducked completely beneath the dripping canvas, feeling his arm tighten protectively around her waist. For what seemed like an eternity, the world outside their makeshift shelter was hell itself. The water in the creek grew uncomfortably warm. Trees along the bank burst into flame with audible pops. Clara could hear the man's labored breathing beside her, feel the tension in his body as he maintained his protective position. And then, gradually, the roaring diminished. The unbearable heat began to lessen, degree by degree. The cowboy cautiously lifted a corner of the coat, peering out at the blackened landscape. "I think the worst has passed," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. Clara emerged from beneath the coat, gasping at the transformed world around them. What had been golden prairie grass was now a smoking, charred wasteland stretching as far as the eye could see. The sagebrush where she had sought shelter was nothing but ash, had this stranger not appeared when he did. "Thank you," she managed through a throat raw from smoke. "You saved my life." The man pulled down his bandana, revealing a strong jaw darkened with stubble and lips cracked from heat. His eyes, Clara noticed with a start, were the clear blue of a mountain lake. "Thomas Turner," he said simply, offering a sooty hand. "Folks call me Trace." Clara took his hand, feeling the strength and calluses of a man who worked hard for his living. "Clara Mitchell, I'm forever in your debt, Mr. Turner." Trace shook his head, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "No debt between neighbors, that's how we survive out here." He looked around at the devastation. "Where were you headed before the fire?" "Home," Clara said, sudden worry creasing her brow. "My family's homestead is 3 miles east of here. My parents, my younger brothers," her voice caught as fear gripped her heart. "The fire was moving west," Trace said, his tone deliberately reassuring. "Your family should be safe, but we'll head that way to make sure." He helped Clara to her feet, both of them soaked and filthy. His horse stood nearby, trembling but unharmed. Trace checked the animal quickly, murmuring praise for its bravery. "Ajax here's got more heart than sense sometimes," he said with obvious affection. "Lucky for us both." He helped Clara mount, then swung up behind her. The saddle wasn't made for two, forcing them to sit close together. Clara felt the solid wall of his chest against her back, his arms encircling her to hold the reins. Despite the circumstances, she found herself acutely aware of this proximity to a man she'd just met. As they rode across the blackened landscape, Clara learned that Trace worked as a ranch hand at the Diamond Bar, a cattle operation a half-day's ride from her family's homestead. He'd been checking fence lines when he spotted the fire and had ridden to warn the neighboring farms and ranches. "I saw your horse running riderless," he explained. "Figured somebody was in trouble." The journey to the Mitchell homestead took longer than expected as they had to navigate around still smoldering areas. With each passing minute, Clara's anxiety grew. When they finally crested the last hill and she saw the familiar buildings intact, she nearly wept with relief. Her family rushed out to meet them, faces etched with worry that transformed to joy upon seeing her. Clara's father, a sturdy man with work-hardened hands, helped her down from the horse while her mother embraced her fiercely, not caring about the soot and ash that covered her daughter. "We thought we'd lost you," her mother said, voice breaking, "when we saw the smoke coming this way." "Mr. Turner saved me," Clara said, turning to introduce her rescuer. Trace had dismounted and stood holding Ajax's reins, suddenly looking somewhat uncomfortable with the attention turned his way. Clara's father stepped forward, offering his hand. "James Mitchell," he said. "I don't know how to thank you for bringing my daughter home." "Anyone would have done the same," Trace replied, though they all knew that wasn't true. Riding toward a wildfire rather than away from it took rare courage. "You'll stay for dinner," Clara's mother insisted, in a tone that brooked no argument. "And the night, too. You and your horse need rest before traveling again." Trace looked as though he might decline, but a glance at his exhausted mount seemed to change his mind. "Much obliged, madam." Ajax could use the rest. As they walked toward the house, Clara fell into step beside Trace. "Thank you again," she said softly. "Not just for saving me, but for making sure I got home." His eyes met hers, and something passed between them, a connection forged in fire and danger. "Like I said, no debt between neighbors." But his voice had softened, and Clara found herself wondering if she would see this man again after he rode out tomorrow. Little did she know, the wildfire that had nearly claimed her life had set in motion events that would irrevocably change both their futures. The Mitchell family welcomed Trace with the warm hospitality that was the hallmark of frontier life. After Clara and Trace had both cleaned up, Clara changing into a fresh dress, Trace borrowing some clothes from her father while his own dried by the fire, they gathered around the table for a simple but hearty meal. Clara's brothers, twins Timothy and Thomas at 16 years old, peppered Trace with questions about his work at the Diamond Bar Ranch and his experience with the fire. Her youngest brother, 12-year-old Samuel, watched the cowboy with undisguised admiration. "How many cattle does Diamond Bar run?" James Mitchell asked as he passed a plate of biscuits. About 3,000 head, Trace replied. Mr. Hargrove's been building the herd for 15 years now, started with nothing but a dream and 100 acres. Hargrove. Clara's mother, Ellen, looked up with interest. Would that be William Hargrove? Trace nodded. Yes, madam, Ellen smiled. I knew his wife Margaret years ago before we moved to Wyoming. How is she? A shadow passed over Trace's features. She passed 2 winters ago, pneumonia. Hit Mr. Hargrove hard. He's not been the same since. I'm sorry to hear that, Ellen said softly. She was a kind woman. The conversation shifted to other topics: the dry summer, prospects for autumn, news from the nearest town of Clearwater. Clara found herself watching Trace as he spoke, noting the quiet confidence in his manner. Unlike some cowboys she'd encountered, he didn't boast or exaggerate. He answered questions directly and listened more than he spoke. After dinner, while Ellen and Clara cleaned up, James invited Trace to sit on the porch. Through the open window, Clara could hear them discussing the fire, its cause, and the damage it had likely done to grazing land. It'll be a hard winter for those who lost pasture, her father was saying. Feed's already scarce with the drought. Mr. Hargrove said he'd open some of our south range to neighbors who need it, Trace replied. We didn't get hit as bad down that way. That's generous. He's a fair man, says we all need to pull together out here. Clara brought coffee out to the porch, using it as an excuse to join the men. Trace thanked her with a nod, his fingers briefly brushing hers as he took the cup. Even that small contact sent an unexpected warmth through her. Clara teaches at the schoolhouse in Clearwater, her father said proudly. Got her education back east before we moved here. Pennsylvania, Clara clarified. Nothing terribly fancy, but enough to qualify me to teach the children here. That's important work, Trace said with genuine respect in his voice. My own schooling was interrupted. Learned more from life than books, I'm afraid. How long have you been with Diamond Bar? Clara asked, settling into a chair nearby. Going on 5 years now. Came up from Texas with a cattle drive and never left. He smiled slightly. Wyoming has a way of getting under your skin. That it does, James agreed, looking out at the land he'd worked so hard to tame. Even with the distant scars of the fire visible, there was beauty in the rolling hills and the mountains rising in the distance. As darkness fell and the family prepared for bed, Clara showed Trace to the small spare room. It's not much, she apologized, but the mattress is clean. More luxury than I'm accustomed to, he assured her. Usually it's just me and the stars. Clara lingered in the doorway. There were so many questions she wanted to ask this man who had appeared from the smoke like a guardian angel. Where had he come from? What had driven him to the solitary life of a cowboy? But propriety held her tongue. Sleep well, Mr. Turner, she said instead. Trace, he corrected gently. After sharing a wildfire, I think we can dispense with formalities. Trace, she repeated, liking the way the name felt. Good night, then. Good night, Clara. She closed the door softly and made her way to her own room, her mind filled with images of blue eyes and strong hands that had pulled her from danger's path. Morning came with the chorus of roosters and the smell of coffee brewing. Clara dressed quickly and headed to the kitchen to help her mother with breakfast, finding Trace already there, insisting on making himself useful by bringing in firewood. Your coat, Clara remembered suddenly. It must be dry by now. I'll fetch it for you. The heavy canvas duster had been hung by the fire overnight. Clara ran her hand over it, remembering how it had shielded her from the fire's wrath. A simple piece of clothing that had possibly saved her life in Trace's hands. When she brought it to him, their eyes met over the weathered material. Thank you for lending it to me, she said softly. Keep it, he replied, surprising her. Might come in handy if you find yourself near another wildfire. The corner of his mouth quirked up. Though I'd prefer if you avoided those altogether. I can't take your coat, Clara protested. Got another in my saddlebags, he assured her. Besides, that one's seen better days. Breakfast was a lively affair with Clara's brothers still full of questions for Trace. Clara noticed how patient he was with them, especially young Samuel, whose enthusiasm knew no bounds. All too soon, it was time for Trace to depart. The entire family walked him to the barn where Ajax had been well rested and fed. You're welcome here anytime, James told him, shaking his hand firmly. Our door is always open to you. I appreciate that, sir. Trace turned to Clara, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Take care of yourself, Miss Mitchell. And you, Trace, she replied, wishing suddenly that he had a reason to stay longer. As he mounted and tipped his hat to the family, Clara felt a curious emptiness. This man had been a stranger to her just yesterday, yet watching him ride away felt like losing something valuable. He seems a decent sort, her father remarked as Trace disappeared over the rise. More than decent, Clara's mother added with a knowing glance at her daughter. It's not every man who would ride toward danger to help a stranger. Clara nodded, unable to articulate the tangle of emotions she felt. Instead, she turned back to the house, the weight of Trace's coat draped over her arm like a promise. 3 weeks passed before Clara saw Trace again. Life had returned to its normal rhythms. She taught at the small schoolhouse in Clearwater during the week, helped with the farm on weekends, and tried not to think too often of the blue-eyed cowboy who had saved her life. The wildfire had been the main topic of conversation throughout the region. Many families had lost pastureland, some had lost livestock, but miraculously, no human lives had been claimed. Clara often wondered if Trace had saved others besides herself that day. It was a Friday afternoon when Clara dismissed her students for the weekend. She gathered her books and papers, preparing for the 3-mile walk home. The summer heat had finally broken, and pleasant autumn weather had settled over the territory, turning the surviving aspen trees into bursts of gold against the evergreens. As she stepped outside the schoolhouse, she was surprised to see a familiar figure leaning against a hitching post, hat tipped low against the afternoon sun. Trace, he straightened at her voice, removing his hat. Miss Mitchell, I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, she replied, unable to contain her smile. What brings you to Clearwater? Ranch business mostly. Mr. Hargrove needed supplies. He gestured to several packages tied to his saddle. But I also wanted to see how you were faring after your encounter with the fire. I'm well, thank you, Clara said, touched by his concern. How about yourself? Can't complain. His eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. Though Ajax still gives me the eye whenever we ride near burned ground, reckon he hasn't forgotten, Clara laughed, nor have I. She glanced at his horse, tied nearby. Is that him? That's my boy, Trace confirmed, pride evident in his voice. Best cow horse in the territory, if you ask me. Clara approached the handsome bay gelding, who regarded her with intelligent eyes. Hello, Ajax. Thank you for your part in my rescue as well. She stroked his velvety nose, and the horse nickered softly. He remembers you, Trace said, coming to stand beside her. Clara was acutely aware of his presence, the clean scent of soap mixed with leather and open air, the way he stood tall but relaxed, as if perfectly at ease in his own skin. I was just heading home, she said. It's a pleasant walk this time of year. Trace glanced at the books in her arms. Those look heavy for a 3-mile walk. Could I offer you a ride? I'm headed in that direction anyway. Clara hesitated only briefly. It wouldn't be improper, he was practically a family friend now, and the road home was a public one. That would be very kind, thank you. Trace took her books, securing them in his saddlebags before helping her mount. As before, he swung up behind her, his arms encircling her to hold the reins. This time, without the panic of the fire, Clara was even more aware of his proximity, the solid strength of him, the gentle way he handled both her and the horse. They rode at an unhurried pace, the late afternoon sun painting the landscape in warm hues. After some minutes of comfortable silence, Trace spoke. Your father mentioned you were educated back east. What brought your family out here? Clara considered the question. My father always wanted his own land. He worked in a factory in Pennsylvania, but he dreamed of open spaces and growing things with his own hands. When the Homestead Act made it possible, he saved everything we had and brought us west. She smiled at the memory. I was 16 and thought it was the end of the world, leaving my friends and the city behind. Now I can't imagine living anywhere else. And your teaching, was that always your plan? Yes, ever since I was a girl, there's something wonderful about watching a child's mind open to new ideas. She turned slightly to see his face. What about you? How did you come to be a cowboy? Trace was quiet for a moment, and Clara wondered if she'd overstepped. Finally, he answered, his voice thoughtful. My father was a rancher in Texas. Small spread, nothing fancy, but it was ours. He taught me everything about cattle, horses, the land. A shadow crossed his features. Lost him and my mother to fever when I was 17. The bank took the ranch. After that, I drifted, worked cattle drives, ranch jobs, learned something new at each place. I'm sorry about your parents, Clara said softly. It was a long time ago, Trace replied, though Clara sensed the wound wasn't as healed as he pretended. Diamond Bar's the first place that's felt something like home since then. They crested a hill, and the Mitchell homestead came into view in the distance. Clara felt a curious reluctance to have their journey end so soon. Will you stay for dinner again? She asked. Mother would be delighted, and the boys haven't stopped talking about you since your last visit. Trace chuckled. I'd like that if it's no trouble. No trouble at all, we always have plenty. As they approached the farm, Clara's youngest brother spotted them and came running. Clara's home, and she's brought Mr. Turner, he announced loudly enough for the entire household to hear. Ellen Mitchell appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face lit up at the sight of Trace. Mr. Turner, what a lovely surprise. You'll join us for supper, I hope. If it's not an imposition, madam, Trace replied as he helped Clara dismount. Nonsense. We're having beef stew, and there's always room for one more at our table. Clara watched as her brothers immediately surrounded Trace, bombarding him with questions about ranch life and his adventures. He answered them with good-natured patience, even as he unsaddled Ajax and tended to the horse's needs. James Mitchell returned from the fields shortly after, greeting Trace with genuine pleasure. Clara observed how easily Trace fit into their family circle, as if he'd been a part of it for years rather than someone they'd met only weeks ago. During dinner, Clara learned more about Trace's life at Diamond Bar. He was more than just a ranch hand. He served as foreman, overseeing the other cowboys and making decisions about the herd's management. Mr. Hargrove trusts my judgment, he explained modestly. He's getting on in years and doesn't ride out as much as he used to. Sounds like you're practically running the place, James observed. Trace shook his head. He's still very much in charge. I just help where I can. After dinner, while Ellen and Clara cleared the table, James invited Trace to examine a problem with one of their horses. The twins and Samuel tagged along, clearly still entranced by the visitor. He's quite taken with you, Ellen remarked casually as she and Clara washed dishes. Who, father? Clara asked, deliberately misunderstanding. Her mother gave her a knowing look. Mr. Turner. I wasn't born yesterday, Clara. I see how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. He's just being kind, mother. He saved my life after all. Ellen murmured noncommittally. And you've been staring at that door waiting for him to come back through it for the past 5 minutes. Clara opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again. Her mother knew her too well. He seems a good man, Ellen continued, her voice softening. Solid, respectful. Not like some of those rough types who come through town. He is, Clara agreed quietly, but his life is at Diamond Bar and mine is here and at the school. It's not practical. Ellen dried her hands on a towel. The heart rarely concerns itself with what's practical, my dear. She touched Clara's cheek gently. Just be careful with yours, that's all I ask. When the men returned from the barn, Clara had composed herself. She served coffee and apple pie, watching surreptitiously as Trace interacted with her family. He was different from the other cowboys she'd met. There was a quietness to him, a thoughtfulness that set him apart. As the evening drew to a close, Trace regretfully announced he needed to return to Diamond Bar. Mr. Hargrove will be expecting these supplies, he explained. You're welcome to stay the night again, James offered. Thank you, but I should get back. Trace turned to Clara. Would you walk with me to the barn while I saddle Ajax? Heart suddenly racing, Clara nodded. They walked in silence across the yard, the stars emerging in the clear night sky above them. In the barn, Trace efficiently prepared his horse for the journey, while Clara held a lantern that cast long shadows across the wooden floor. Your family's been very kind to me, he said as he tightened the cinch. They like you, Clara replied. We all do, Trace paused in his work, looking at her across Ajax's back. "I've been thinking about you, Clara, more than I probably should." The simple honesty of his words took her breath away. "I've thought about you too," she admitted. "I'd like to call on you properly if you'd allow it." His voice was steady, but Clara sensed the vulnerability beneath it. "I know it's a fair distance between Diamond Bar and your home, but I could ride over on Sundays when you're not teaching." Clara felt a flutter of happiness in her chest. "I'd like that very much." Trace's smile transformed his face, softening the weathered lines and lighting his eyes. "Then I'll see you on Sunday next. I'll look forward to it." He led Ajax out of the barn, Clara following with the lantern. Her family was still on the porch, and Trace bid them all a polite goodbye before mounting. "Till Sunday, Miss Mitchell," he said softly, tipping his hat to her. "Till Sunday, Mr. Turner," she replied, hugging Trace's old duster around her shoulders against the evening chill. As he rode away, Clara felt her mother's knowing gaze but refused to meet it. Some feelings were too new, too tender to be discussed. Whatever was growing between her and Trace, she wanted to nurture it privately for now, like a seedling that needed protection before it could face the world. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. True to his word, Trace arrived at the Mitchell homestead the following Sunday just after church services had ended. Clara had been watching for him from her bedroom window and saw him approaching from a distance, his straight figure unmistakable even from afar. She had taken special care with her appearance that morning, wearing her best Sunday dress of deep blue calico with white lace at the collar and cuffs. Her mother had noticed her unusual attention to detail and had smiled knowingly, but said nothing. Trace had also clearly made an effort for the occasion. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and he wore a clean white shirt under a dark vest. The transformation from working cowboy to proper suitor was striking, though Clara found she liked both versions of the man equally well. The day was spent pleasantly in the company of her family, a Sunday dinner that Ellen had prepared with extra care, followed by conversation on the porch. Later, Clara's father suggested a walk to show Trace the apple orchard they had planted 3 years prior, which was finally bearing fruit. "Would you like to walk a bit farther?" Trace asked quietly when the orchard tour was complete, and her family had tactfully retreated toward the house, giving them some privacy while remaining within sight for propriety's sake. Clara nodded, and they strolled toward a small creek that marked the boundary of the Mitchell property. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, dappling the ground with patches of golden light. "How was your week?" Clara asked, genuinely interested in his life at Diamond Bar. "Busy," Trace replied. "We're preparing for the fall roundup, checking which cattle to drive to market and which to keep through winter." He glanced at her. "But good, better than good knowing I'd see you today." The simple honesty of his words warmed Clara more than the autumn sunshine. "And your teaching?" he asked. "How are your students faring?" Clara smiled, touched that he remembered and cared about her work. "They're doing well. Little Emma Wilson finally mastered her multiplication tables, which we've been working on for months." They reached the creek, where a fallen log provided a natural bench. Trace checked it for stability before inviting Clara to sit. They watched the water bubble over stones for a moment, comfortable in each other's company. "I brought something for you," Trace said, reaching into his vest pocket. He withdrew a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. "It's nothing fancy." Clara carefully unwrapped the gift to find a small wooden carving of a horse, clearly meant to represent Ajax. The detail was remarkable, from the proud arch of the neck to the alert expression in the eyes. "Did you make this?" she asked, running her finger over the smooth wood. Trace nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "Whittling passes the time during night watches. I'm no artist." "It's beautiful," Clara said sincerely. "Thank you." Their eyes met, and Clara felt the now familiar flutter in her chest. There was something about Trace Turner that made her feel both completely at ease and wonderfully alive. "May I call on you again next Sunday?" he asked. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," she replied honestly, and so began a courtship that unfolded through the golden days of autumn. Each Sunday, Trace would ride the considerable distance from Diamond Bar to spend the day with Clara and her family. Sometimes they would all play games or sing songs after dinner. Other times, Clara and Trace would take walks alone, getting to know each other better with each meeting. Clara learned that beneath Trace's quiet exterior was a man of deep thoughts and surprising humor. He told her stories of cattle drives and cowboy pranks, of the characters he'd met in his travels, of the beauty he'd seen across the territories. In turn, she shared her experiences teaching, her dreams for the future, her love of books and learning. As October turned to November, the weather grew colder. Their walks became shorter, but their conversations deeper. One Sunday, as they sat by the fire in the Mitchell home while the first snow of the season fell outside, Trace spoke of his hopes for a place of his own someday. "Not immediately," he clarified. "Mr. Hargrove pays me well and I've been saving, but eventually I'd like land that's mine. A small ranch to start, something I could build on over time." "That sounds wonderful," Clara said, imagining such a life. "Where would this ranch be?" Trace looked at her intently. "That would depend," he said carefully, "on where the people I care about are located." The implication hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to put specific words to the feelings that had been growing steadily over the past months. When Christmas approached, bringing with it a particularly harsh cold snap, Clara worried that the weather might prevent Trace from making his regular Sunday visit. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and snow lay thick on the ground. It would be foolish for anyone to attempt the long ride from Diamond Bar in such conditions. Yet on Christmas Eve, as the Mitchell family gathered around the fire after dinner, they heard the sound of hoofbeats outside. James opened the door to find Trace, his coat and hat covered in snow, his face red from cold. "Trace," Clara exclaimed, rushing forward. "You shouldn't have come in this weather, couldn't miss Christmas," he replied simply, stamping snow from his boots. "Though Ajax might disagree with my decision." Ellen immediately set about getting him warm, insisting he sit by the fire, pressing a cup of hot coffee into his hands, sending the boys to tend to his horse. Clara watched him with a mixture of exasperation and deep affection. The man had risked frostbite to see her on Christmas. After he had warmed up sufficiently, Trace reached into his saddlebag, which he'd brought in from the cold. From it, he withdrew several carefully wrapped packages. "Just some small tokens," he said modestly, distributing them to the family. For James, there was a fine pocket knife with a bone handle. The twins received identical leather pouches filled with marbles. Samuel got a small wooden flute that Trace had carved himself. For Ellen, a set of delicate handkerchiefs embroidered with wildflowers that he'd purchased from a traveling peddler. Finally, he turned to Clara, holding out a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "Merry Christmas, Clara," he said softly. Clara unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small book of poetry Tennyson's collected works. She ran her fingers over the embossed cover, touched beyond words. "Open it," Trace urged. Inside the front cover, written in careful script, were the words, "To Clara, whose brightness outshines the wildfire that brought us together. With deepest affection, Trace." Clara looked up at him, her heart so full she could scarcely speak. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's perfect." The Mitchell family had gifts for Trace as well: warm woolen socks knitted by Ellen, a new bridle for Ajax from James, and a framed sketch of Ajax that Clara had drawn from memory, based on the many times she'd seen Trace's beloved horse. "This is remarkable," Trace said, studying the drawing with genuine appreciation. "You've captured him exactly." The evening passed in warmth and laughter, with carols sung around the fire and stories shared. When it came time for bed, no one suggested Trace should attempt the journey back to Diamond Bar. It was understood he would stay the night and return in the morning. As the family dispersed to their rooms, Clara lingered behind, wanting a moment alone with Trace. Her parents, understanding, pretended not to notice as they herded the boys upstairs. "You shouldn't have risked the journey," Clara scolded gently once they were alone. "What if something had happened to you on the way?" "Some things are worth the risk," Trace replied, his eyes holding her steadily. "Seeing you is one of them." Clara felt the familiar flutter in her chest intensify. "I'm glad you came," she admitted. "Christmas wouldn't have been the same without you." Trace stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Clara," he said, his voice low, These past months have been the happiest of my life. I never expected to find someone like you. Nor I you, she replied softly. May I? He hesitated, then gathered his courage. May I kiss you good night? Clara's heart raced. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Trace leaned down, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His lips met hers in a kiss that was tender and respectful, yet held the promise of deeper passion. It lasted only a moment, but when they parted, Clara knew with certainty that she was falling in love with this man who had rescued her from a wildfire and, in the process, ignited something equally powerful within her heart. Good night, Clara, he whispered. Good night, Trace, she replied, her voice unsteady. She climbed the stairs to her room, her fingers touching her lips where the warmth of his kiss still lingered. Winter's grip held tight through January and February, making travel difficult. Trace's Sunday visits became less regular, dependent on weather and the demands of the ranch during the harsh season. Each separation felt longer to Clara, each reunion sweeter. They exchanged letters when they couldn't meet in person, Trace's surprisingly eloquent, despite his claims of limited education. Clara kept each one tied with a ribbon in a special box, reading them often when she missed him most. When spring finally began to soften the landscape in March, Clara received unexpected news. The territorial governor had approved funds for a larger schoolhouse in Clearwater, and Clara was offered the position of head teacher, with an assistant to help with the growing number of students. It was an honor and a significant advance in her career, but it would mean longer hours and more responsibility. When Trace came that Sunday, Clara shared both her excitement and her concerns. It's a wonderful opportunity, she told him as they walked along the creek, now flowing freely after the winter thaw. But I worry about the time it will demand. We already see each other so little. I'm proud of you, Trace said, taking her hand in his. You shouldn't let anything stand in the way of your teaching. It's what you love. Not all that I love, Clara replied before she could stop herself. Trace stopped walking, turning to face her fully. His eyes searched hers. What are you saying, Clara? She took a deep breath, summoning her courage. They had been courting for months, dancing around the depth of their feelings without putting them into words. But life was too uncertain, the future too precious to waste in ambiguity. I love you, Trace Turner, she said clearly. I believe I began falling in love with you the moment you wrapped me in your coat and sheltered me from the fire. Joy spread across his features, lighting his eyes. I've loved you just as long, he confessed. Maybe from the moment I saw you pressed against that sagebrush, refusing to surrender to the flames. You looked so fierce, so determined. He took both her hands in his expression becoming serious. I've been waiting to speak until I had something solid to offer you. I've been talking with Mr. Hargrove. He's getting older, finding it harder to manage Diamond Bar on his own since his wife passed. He has no children to inherit. Clara's pulse quickened as she began to understand what Trace was saying. He's offered me a partnership, Trace continued. To start, I'd own a quarter share of the ranch with the opportunity to increase my stake over time. Eventually, when he's ready to retire fully, I could buy him out completely. Trace, that's wonderful, Clara exclaimed, squeezing his hands. It means I could offer you a home, Clara. A good life. His voice deepened with emotion. If you'd want that, with me. Are you asking what I think you're asking? Clara whispered, hardly daring to believe this moment had arrived. Trace released her hands, only to lower himself to one knee on the damp spring earth. From his pocket, he withdrew a small ring, a simple band of gold with a single pearl set in the center. Clara Mitchell, you've brought light and joy into my life that I never thought to find. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Tears filled Clara's eyes, blurring her vision. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you. Trace slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms. This time, their kiss was not hesitant, but filled with the promise of their future together, passionate yet tender. The perfect expression of the love that had grown between them since that fateful day when Wildfire had threatened to take everything. When they returned to the house, hand in hand, Clara's family took one look at their radiant faces and erupted in cheers. Ellen wiped happy tears from her eyes while James clapped Trace firmly on the back. The boys whooped with excitement at the prospect of having a real cowboy for a brother-in-law. They set the wedding date for June, after the school term ended, and before the busiest season at Diamond Bar would begin. Clara would continue teaching at the new school, riding to and from Clearwater each day from their home at the ranch. It was not a conventional arrangement, but then, theirs had never been a conventional courtship. The following weeks passed in a flurry of preparation. Clara and her mother worked on her wedding dress, while Trace busied himself preparing their future home, a comfortable cabin on the Diamond Bar property that Mr. Hargrove had offered them as a wedding gift. In early May, just weeks before the wedding, Clara was at the schoolhouse late one afternoon, organizing materials for the next day's lessons. The other children had left, but 10-year-old Emily Preston remained, waiting for her father, who was unusually delayed in picking her up. "You can go on home, Miss Mitchell," Emily said, noticing Clara's frequent glances at the clock. "I can wait alone. Pa probably just got held up at the store." "I wouldn't dream of leaving you by yourself," Clara replied with a reassuring smile. "I'm sure he'll be along soon." Just then, the schoolhouse door burst open. Instead of Emily's father, it was Bill Garrett, the local stable hand, his face pale with urgency. "Miss Mitchell, you need to come quick. There's a fire at Diamond Bar." Clara's heart seized with terror. "Trace is he, don't know details, madam." "Word just reached town. They're fighting it now, but it's bad." Clara turned to Emily, torn between her duty to the child and her desperate need to reach Diamond Bar. "Emily, go," the girl said with surprising maturity. "I'll wait right here for Pa, I promise." After a moment's hesitation, Clara grabbed her shawl. "Bill, can you take me there?" The man nodded grimly. "Got my wagon outside. We'll make it quick as we can." The journey to Diamond Bar was the longest of Clara's life, though Bill pushed his horses harder than was wise on the rutted roads. As they drew closer, they could see the smoke rising against the evening sky, black and ominous. "Dear God," Clara whispered, "please let him be safe." When they finally reached the ranch, it was a scene of organized chaos. Men on horseback were moving cattle away from the burning barn, while others formed a bucket brigade from the well to fight the flames. The main house appeared untouched, but the large barn and several outbuildings were engulfed. Clara leapt from the wagon before it had fully stopped. "Where is Trace Turner?" she demanded of the first person she reached, a soot-covered ranch hand she didn't recognize. "Inside," the man gasped, jerking his head toward the barn. "Went in after old Jorge, who was trapped. They ain't come out yet." Cold horror washed over Clara. Without thinking, she started toward the blazing structure, only to be held back firmly by Mr. Hargrove himself. "No, Miss Mitchell," the older man said, his face grim with worry. "We can't lose you too." "I can't just stand here," Clara cried, struggling against his grip. As if in answer to her desperation, there was a commotion near the barn door. Through the smoke and flames emerged two figures, one supporting the other. Trace, his face blackened with soot, was half carrying Jorge, the elderly Mexican groom who had worked at Diamond Bar longer than anyone. Several men rushed forward to help, taking Jorge from Trace's arms just as Trace himself stumbled and fell to his knees, overcome by smoke. Clara broke free and ran to him, falling to the ground beside him. "Trace," she cried, cradling his face in her hands. "Trace, look at me." His eyes, red-rimmed and watering, focused on her face. "Clara," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" "Trying to stop you from getting yourself killed," she replied, relief and anger battling within her. "Can you stand? We need to get you away from the smoke." With her help and that of another ranch hand, Trace managed to stagger to the relative safety of the yard near the main house. Someone brought water, which Clara helped him drink before using a clean handkerchief to wipe the worst of the soot from his face. "Jorge?" Trace asked between coughs. "They're tending to him," Clara assured him. "He's alive, thanks to you." Trace closed his eyes briefly, nodding. "What happened?" Clara asked, still holding tightly to his hand as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. "Lightning strike," Trace explained, his voice rough from the smoke. "Hit the hay loft, spread so fast." He was interrupted by a fit of coughing. "Don't try to talk," Clara urged, but Trace shook his head, determined to finish. "Jorge was in the back stalls, couldn't get out, had to try." Another coughing fit overtook him. Clara felt a surge of conflicting emotions: pride in his bravery, terror at how close she'd come to losing him, and a deep, fierce love that overshadowed everything else. "You could have been killed," she said softly. Trace's hand tightened around hers. "Couldn't leave him," he replied simply, as if there had been no choice to make. It was the same instinct that had driven him toward a wildfire to save a woman he didn't know, Clara realized. The same courage and compassion that had first drawn her to him. The fire continued to burn through the night, but the men of Diamond Bar managed to contain it to the barn and nearest outbuildings. By dawn, it was reduced to smoldering embers, leaving behind a scene of blackened destruction. Clara stayed at Trace's side through it all, insisting on caring for him herself when the doctor, who was summoned from Clearwater, confirmed he had suffered no serious burns, only smoke inhalation that would heal with time and rest. "You need to go home," Trace told her as morning light began to filter through the windows of the small infirmary room where he lay. "Your family will be worried." "I sent word with one of the ranch hands," Clara replied. "I'm not leaving you." Trace's lips curved into a tired smile. "Stubborn woman, you're one to talk, charging into burning buildings." She smoothed back his hair, still smelling of smoke despite their efforts to clean him up. "What were you thinking?" "Wasn't thinking," Trace admitted. "Just couldn't bear the thought of Jorge trapped in there." "He's been like a father to me these past years." Clara nodded, understanding completely. It was one of the things she loved most about Trace, his instinctive drive to protect others, regardless of the cost to himself. "The barn can be rebuilt," Mr. Hargrove said from the doorway where he had appeared unnoticed. "Men can't." "You did right, Turner." Trace attempted to sit up straighter, but Clara gently restrained him. "The cattle," he asked his employer, "all accounted for." "We lost some feed and equipment, but nothing that can't be replaced." The older man's eyes held genuine affection as he looked at Trace. "You get some rest now, that's an order. Miss Mitchell, make sure he obeys." "I will, Mr. Hargrove," Clara assured him. When they were alone again, Trace reached for Clara's hand. "I'm sorry if I frightened you." "You did," she admitted, "but I also understand why you did what you did. It's who you are, Trace. I wouldn't change that, even if it means my heart stops occasionally." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I love you, Clara Mitchell. And I love you, Trace Turner. Now rest. We still have a wedding to prepare for." The incident at Diamond Bar delayed some of their preparations, as Trace needed time to recover and then was busy with the barn rebuilding efforts. But by early June, both Trace's health and the ranch repairs were well in hand, and the wedding plans proceeded. On the morning of June 15, 1877, Clara stood in her bedroom at the Mitchell homestead, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her from the small mirror. Her wedding dress, sewn by her mother with help from the women of Clearwater, was simple but beautiful ivory cotton with lace trim salvaged from Ellen's own wedding gown. "You look radiant," Ellen said, carefully placing the crown of wildflowers on Clara's head. "I feel like I'm dreaming," Clara replied, touching the delicate blossoms. "Is this really happening?" Ellen smiled, adjusting the flowers slightly. "It is indeed, and you couldn't have chosen a finer man." There was a knock at the door, and James Mitchell entered, stopping short at the sight of his daughter in her bridal finery. "My little girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When did you grow into such a beautiful woman?" Clara embraced her father tightly. "I'll always be your little girl, Pa, no matter what." James cleared his throat, blinking rapidly. "The wagon's ready whenever you are. Everyone's gathered at the church." Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm ready." The small church in Clearwater was filled to capacity. It seemed everyone in the area had turned out for the wedding of the schoolteacher and the Diamond Bar foreman. Clara's students sat in the front rows, the girls clutching small posies of wildflowers that matched her crown. As the simple organ music began, Clara walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes fixed on the man waiting for her at the altar. Trace looked nothing like the soot-covered cowboy who had pulled her from the path of a wildfire nearly a year ago. Dressed in a new black suit, his dark hair neatly combed, he looked distinguished and impossibly handsome. But his eyes, those clear blue eyes that had captivated her from the first, were exactly the same as they watched her approach, filled with a love so pure and powerful it took her breath away. When her father placed her hand in Trace's, Clara felt the familiar calloused strength of his fingers close around hers. Whatever the future might hold, she knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. The minister's words washed over her as they exchanged their vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish one another for all the days of their lives. When Trace slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, his hands trembled slightly, the only outward sign of the emotion Clara could see burning in his eyes. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "Mr. Turner, you may kiss your bride." Trace cradled her face gently between his hands, as if she were made of the finest porcelain, and lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was tender but held the promise of the passion they would share in the privacy of their new home. When they parted, the church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration continued at the Diamond Bar Ranch, where tables had been set up in the shade of the cottonwood trees. Mr. Hargrove had spared no expense, providing a feast that would be talked about for years to come. There was music and dancing, laughter and tears of joy. As evening approached, Trace took Clara's hand and led her away from the festivities toward their new home. The small cabin had been transformed in recent weeks. Curtains hung at the windows, a handmade quilt adorned the bed, and wildflowers filled vases on every surface. "Welcome home, Mrs. Turner," Trace said softly, lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Clara wrapped her arms around his neck, overwhelmed by the love she felt for this man and the life they would build together. "Home," she repeated. "It has such a wonderful sound." Trace set her gently on her feet once they were inside, but kept his arms around her. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small pouch and placed it in her palm. Clara opened it to find a delicate gold locket. Inside was a tiny sprig of sagebrush, preserved and sealed beneath glass. "To remember where our story began," Trace explained. "The day Wildfire brought us together." Tears filled Clara's eyes as she looked up at him. "I could never forget. It was the day my life truly began." As night fell over Diamond Bar Ranch, Clara and Trace Turner began their life together. Their love, like the wildfire that had first brought them together, powerful, transformative, and unstoppable. In the years that followed, Clara and Trace built a life that exceeded even their most hopeful dreams. Their partnership at Diamond Bar flourished as Trace's knowledge of cattle ranching combined with Clara's sharp mind for business helped the operation expand and prosper. Mr. Hargrove, watching them with pride, gradually stepped back from daily management, entrusting more responsibilities to the young couple. Clara continued teaching at the Clearwater School, riding to and from town each day on a gentle mare Trace had trained specifically for her. Her students adored her, and she found deep fulfillment in watching young minds develop under her guidance. In the afternoons and evenings, she would work alongside Trace on ranch business, the two of them making decisions together about Diamond Bar's future. Their first child, a daughter they named Eleanor Hope, arrived in the spring of 1879. Clara had been frightened during the difficult labor, but when the midwife placed the tiny infant in her arms, all fear vanished in the face of overwhelming love. Trace, who had paced anxiously outside throughout the ordeal, wept unashamedly when he held his daughter for the first time. "She has your eyes," Clara whispered, watching father and daughter regard each other solemnly. "And your determination," Trace replied as the infant gripped his finger with surprising strength. "Look at that grip. She'll be riding before she walks." He was right. Eleanor Ellie, as she was quickly nicknamed, grew into a spirited child who loved nothing more than accompanying her father around the ranch. By the age of 4, she could ride almost as well as children twice her age, her dark curls flying behind her as she urged her pony faster. 2 years after Ellie's birth came James Thomas, named for both grandfathers. Unlike his adventurous sister, Jamie was a thoughtful, quiet child who loved books as much as his mother did. He would sit for hours listening to Clara read, absorbing stories and information like a sponge. In 1884, Their family was completed with the arrival of twins Michael and Matthew. The boys, identical in appearance but opposite in temperament, brought new joy and considerable chaos to the Turner household. Trace built an addition to their cabin, which by then had already been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family. Through it all, Clara and Trace's love for each other only deepened. The passion that had sparked between them during their courtship matured into something even more powerful, a partnership of equals built on trust, respect, and unwavering commitment. They faced challenges together, celebrated triumphs as one, and created a home filled with laughter and love. In 1888, Mr. Hargrove, now in his 70s and increasingly frail, called Trace and Clara to the main house for a serious conversation. "I've made my decision," he told them, his voice weaker than it had been but his eyes still sharp. "I'm ready to retire completely. I want to sell you my remaining share of Diamond Bar." Trace and Clara exchanged a glance. Over the years, they had gradually increased their ownership to nearly half the ranch, but purchasing the remainder would require a substantial investment. "Are you certain, sir?" Trace asked. "You know you'll always have a home here, regardless." The older man nodded. "I'm certain. My Margaret and I built this place from nothing, but it's your home now, yours and those 4 remarkable children of yours. It should belong to you completely." After discussion, they reached an agreement that was fair to all. Mr. Hargrove would retain lifetime rights to his house and a small pension, while Trace and Clara would become the sole owners of Diamond Bar Ranch. That night, after the children were asleep, Trace and Clara stood on the porch of their home, no longer a small cabin, but a comfortable house that had grown with their family. "Did you ever imagine this?" Clara asked, leaning against her husband's solid strength as they looked out over the ranch that was now entirely theirs. "When you rode toward that wildfire all those years ago?" Trace's arm tightened around her waist. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "I was just trying to help someone in trouble. I never expected to find the other half of my soul." Clara turned in his arms to face him. At 35, Trace was still as handsome as the day they'd met, though silver now threaded through his dark hair at the temples. The years of working outdoors had etched fine lines around his eyes, but those eyes still held the same warmth, the same depth that had captured her heart. "Do you remember what you said to me that day?" she asked. "When you wrapped me in your coat?" Trace smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. "I believe I said the fire was coming fast, and the coat wouldn't stop it but might give us a chance." Clara nodded, laying her hand against his cheek. "You were talking about the wildfire, but you might as well have been talking about us. The fire between us came fast, and there was no stopping it." "No stopping it," Trace agreed, lowering his mouth to hers in a kiss that, even after 11 years of marriage, still made her heart race. "And I wouldn't have it any other way." As they stood together under the vast Wyoming sky, surrounded by the land they loved and the home they had built, Clara felt a profound sense of gratitude. The wildfire that had nearly claimed her life had instead given her something precious beyond measure, a love as powerful and transformative as the flames themselves, but infinitely more enduring. In the spring of 1902, 25 years after Trace had wrapped Clara in his soaked coat to shield her from the wildfire, Diamond Bar Ranch hosted a celebration. The occasion was ostensibly their silver wedding anniversary, but in reality, it was much more a gathering of all the people whose lives had been touched by Clara and Trace Turner over the years. Former students of Clara's, now adults with children of their own, traveled from as far as Denver to honor the teacher who had shaped their minds and hearts. Cowboys who had learned their craft under Trace's patient guidance returned to pay their respects to the man many considered the finest rancher in the territory. Neighbors who had weathered droughts, blizzards, and economic hardships alongside the Turners came to celebrate the couple who had always been first to offer help in times of need. And at the center of it all was the Turner family itself. Eleanor, now 23 and a teacher like her mother, had returned from her position at a school in Cheyenne, bringing her fiancé, a young doctor she would marry that autumn. James Thomas, 21, was studying law at the university in Laramie but still considered Diamond Bar his true home. The twins, Michael and Matthew, 18 and inseparable despite their differences, helped manage the ranch alongside their father, each bringing unique strengths to the family business. Clara, at 49, was still striking her chestnut hair now streaked with silver, her face lined from years of Wyoming sun and wind, but her eyes as bright and expressive as ever. She had eventually retired from formal teaching to focus on the ranch and family, but education remained her passion. The small library she had established at Diamond Bar had grown to over 500 volumes, and she had personally taught dozens of ranch children and adults to read over the years. Trace, at 51, moved a bit more slowly than in his younger days, the result of countless falls from horses and the physical demands of ranch life. But he remained strong, his mind sharp, his leadership of Diamond Bar respected throughout the territory. Under his and Clara's stewardship, the ranch had grown to over 10,000 acres, running some of the finest cattle in Wyoming. As evening approached on the day of the celebration, Trace found Clara standing alone near the old cottonwood trees where they had held their wedding reception 25 years earlier. She was watching their children mingling with the guests, a small smile playing on her lips. "Penny for your thoughts," Trace said, slipping his arm around her waist in a gesture so familiar it was like breathing. "I was just thinking about how fortunate we've been," Clara replied, leaning into his embrace, "to have built all this together. To see our children grow into such remarkable people." Trace nodded, following her gaze to where Ellie was laughing with her fiancé. Jamie was deep in conversation with one of Clara's former students, and the twins were entertaining younger guests with roping tricks. "We have been blessed," he agreed, "though I think fortune had less to do with it than hard work, mostly yours." Clara turned to face him, her expression suddenly serious. "Do you ever regret it? Any of it? The struggles, the hard years, being tied to this place and all its demands?" Trace considered the question thoughtfully, as he did all things. "Not for a moment," he said finally. "Every difficulty we faced together. That makes even the hardest times bearable." His blue eyes, still capable of making her heart beat faster after all these years, held her steadily. "The only thing I might have done differently is ride faster toward that wildfire when I first saw the smoke. Might have reached you sooner." Clara laughed, the sound as warm and rich as it had been in her youth. "You reached me exactly when you were meant to, Trace Turner. Not a moment too soon or too late." From the main gathering came the sound of music starting up, fiddles and a guitar playing a familiar tune. Trace's face lit with recognition. "They're playing our wedding song," he said, taking her hand. "Mrs. Turner, may I have this dance?" Clara curtsied playfully. "I thought you'd never ask, Mr. Turner." As they moved toward the makeshift dance floor, Clara felt a familiar weight against her chest, the gold locket Trace had given her on their wedding night, containing the sprig of sagebrush. She had worn it every day for 25 years, a constant reminder of how their story began. Trace led her in a dance that was slower than the ones of their youth, but no less meaningful. Around them swirled family and friends, the past and the present merging in a moment of perfect contentment. "Do you remember," Clara asked softly, "what you wrote in that first book you gave me, about the wildfire that brought us together?" Trace smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "To Clara, whose brightness outshines the wildfire that brought us together," he quoted. "I meant every word then, and I mean it even more now." As the music played and the stars began to appear in the vast Wyoming sky, Clara rested her head against her husband's shoulder, overcome with gratitude for the life they had built together. The wildfire that had threatened to destroy her had instead led her to the greatest blessing of her life, a love as enduring as the land itself, as steadfast as the man who held her in his arms. And in that moment, surrounded by the fruits of a life well lived, Clara knew with absolute certainty that their story, which had begun in danger and desperation, had evolved into something rare and precious. A love story for the ages, born in fire but tempered by time into something unbreakable. "I love you, Trace Turner," she whispered, "yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows." "And I love you, Clara Turner," he replied, more with each passing day. As they danced beneath the stars, their children watching with affection, Clara knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them as they had faced everything in the past quarter-century together, with courage and unwavering love. Their story, which had begun when Wildfire pinned a woman against Sagebrush and a cowboy soaked his coat to wrap her safe, would continue to unfold, page by beautiful page, for many years to come.